My name is Naomi Mercer. I'm 52 years old, and the morning they decided I was too old to understand the cloud didn't begin with shouting. It began with a conference room, bad coffee, corporate applause, and a man in an expensive suit smiling like he'd already replaced me before he'd even learned my name. I had spent 19 years as the senior systems administrator at Whitmore Financial Services in Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous work. Not the kind that gets your face in company newsletters or your name praised at retreats where people clap for slogans they'll forget by Monday. My work lived in the background, in clean backups, in patch servers, in stable systems, in disaster recovery plans nobody cared about until disaster actually showed up. That was me, invisible in the way oxygen is invisible. Nobody notices it until the room starts running out. I started there in 2005, back when most of our infrastructure still lived on physical servers in a basement room that smelled like overheated plastic, burnt coffee, and stress sweat. The server room was really just a converted storage closet with industrial fans duct taped to the ceiling because the building's HVAC couldn't handle the heat load. I spent my first 3 months just keeping that room from setting off the fire alarms every time we pushed a new machine live. Over 19 years, I watched the whole industry mutate. I helped move us from physical servers to virtualization back when people still acted like VMware was a gamble. I designed our first hybrid cloud architecture when AWS still sounded experimental to half the executives in the building. I built the backup systems that saved Whitmore during the ransomware attempt in 2019. 3 days of hell, almost no sleep, and enough pressure to crack bone. But we recovered. We kept 8 years of client data from disappearing into smoke. I wrote documentation that trained 3 generations of junior admins. I mentored people who now ran departments of their own. Some of them still sent me Christmas cards. Not because I was warm. I'm not. But because I taught them the difference between theory and survival. The difference between a certification and 3 a.m., with executives breathing down your neck while the system burns and nobody cares what the manual says. 19 years of institutional knowledge. 19 years of knowing which vendor would answer the phone in the middle of the night and which one would send you to voicemail hell. 19 years of understanding which ugly old configuration looked terrible on paper but worked flawlessly under pressure. 19 years of keeping the lights on while other people collected the credit for standing in the room after I'd already stopped it from collapsing. Then came Monday morning, February 12th. Mandatory IT department meeting, 9 a.m. sharp. Our CTO, Barbara Whitmore, stood at the front of the conference room with the expression of a woman who had practiced sounding confident in private and still wasn't sure she believed herself. Barbara was third-generation Whitmore. Decent boss, overall. She stayed out of deep technical decisions, trusted competent people, and only hovered when something was actively catching fire. I'd worked with her for 12 years. I respected her more than most executives I'd met. Standing just behind her was the problem. Mid-30s, maybe? Haircut so precise it looked professionally engineered. Bluetooth earpiece he did not need in a conference room. Slim-fit suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He stood there with both hands clasped behind his back like he was posing for a leadership magazine cover. Barbara cleared her throat. Said the company was entering a new phase of digital transformation. Said the market demanded agility, innovation, fresh leadership. Said she was proud to introduce our new director of IT infrastructure, Brandon Kessler. Even his name sounded expensive, like it came with inherited lake property and opinions about wine. Barbara read off his credentials the way people read from brochures when they've already decided the packaging matters more than the product. MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. 5 years at a cloud consulting firm in Chicago. Certified across AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and several other platforms most companies barely used. Speaker at industry conferences. Author of a white paper on digital transformation best practices. What she did not mention, because she probably didn't know, was whether he had ever personally handled a production outage at scale, whether he had ever rebuilt a corrupted database under deadline, whether he had ever faced a room full of executives asking for ETAs every 5 minutes while the system stayed dead, whether he had ever been responsible for anything that could actually break. Brandon stepped forward, smiling with perfect posture. He thanked Barbara for the opportunity, said he was excited to modernize our infrastructure and bring Whitmore into the 21st century. Into the 21st century, like we'd been delivering data by wagon. Like I hadn't spent years building cloud migrations that processed millions of transactions without public drama. He talked for 20 minutes. Buzzwords piled on top of buzzwords until the whole presentation sounded like a consulting deck caught in a wind tunnel. Cloud native architecture, agile deployment pipelines, containerized microservices, zero trust security frameworks, serverless paradigms, DevOps culture integration. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Every concept hovered at the exact depth of someone who had skimmed an article and mistaken familiarity for mastery. He never once mentioned our actual environment. Not the compliance constraints, not the regulatory exposure, not the legacy integrations that couldn't simply be torn out because some slide deck preferred cleaner diagrams. Not the reality of nearly 2 decades of systems layered together through experience, compromise, and survival. When the meeting ended, people clapped. That hollow corporate clap. The kind that means nothing except, I would like to remain employed. I stayed seated while most of the room emptied. Drew Collins, one of my junior admins, though after 6 years under me, he hadn't really been junior for a while, caught my eye on the way out. His expression said exactly what mine probably did. What was that? I only gave a small shrug. Same thing that always happens, I muttered once the room thinned. Someone decides experience is old-fashioned and credentials are destiny. Near the door, Janet Holloway lingered. Janet had been with Whitmore 11 years. Sharp, steady, and one of the few people in the building I trusted not to confuse confidence with competence. She mouthed, "Coffee later?" I nodded. Within an hour, Brandon had scheduled one-on-one meetings with everyone in IT. Mine was at 2 p.m. Apparently, seniority meant I got to wait longest to hear how my career was about to be reorganized by someone who hadn't yet learned where the cracks in the floor were. So I did what I always did. I worked, monitored systems, reviewed logs, handled the tickets that had come in overnight. Accounting had locked themselves out again. The satellite office had a network issue that turned out to be a loose Ethernet cable. Compliance had questions about backup retention policy. Normal problems. Invisible problems. The kind of work that keeps a company alive and never appears in a performance review as anything more than met expectations. At 1:58, I walked to Brandon's office. It used to be the storage room we had converted into a temporary server room years ago, before the infrastructure moved to the data center across town. I had personally run cable through those walls back in 2008. Now the walls were painted executive gray and decorated with motivational posters. One said, "Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower." Another said, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." He had 3 monitors set up in a semicircle like he was directing missile launches, standing desk, ergonomic keyboard shaped like a design mistake. Everything in the room looked expensive and untouched. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Didn't stand. Didn't shake my hand. Didn't offer coffee or water. Just pointed. I sat. He started by saying he'd reviewed my personnel file. Said my 19 years with the company were impressive. Said my dedication was clear. Said my experience was valuable. Then came the pause. That polished, poisonous pause people use right before saying something offensive in a tone they think sounds professional. He said the industry had changed significantly since I started. Said cloud infrastructure required a different mindset than traditional systems administration. Said younger professionals adapted more naturally to emerging paradigms. Then he went further. Said there was research suggesting cognitive flexibility declined with age, making it harder to truly absorb modern technologies. I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, at the watch on his wrist, at the self-satisfaction sitting behind his eyes, at the way he said age like he was discussing weather instead of a human being sitting 3 feet from him. I asked whether he had reviewed my actual work, the cloud migrations I led, the AWS certifications I earned on my own time and my own money, the Azure implementations I designed, the disaster recovery systems that helped save this company during the ransomware attack. He smiled. That thin, patronizing smile people use when they've decided the conclusion before the conversation starts. Said he appreciated my willingness to learn. Said it was admirable that I had made the effort to stay current. But there was always a but. He said we needed to be realistic about generational differences. Said people my age often struggled with cloud concepts even when they tried to adapt. "It's not a criticism, Naomi," he said smoothly. "It's just biological reality." Biological reality. I was 52, not dead. I had been building cloud infrastructure since before some of his certifications existed, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of my anger. I just sat there and let him keep talking. He went on about fresh perspectives, modern leadership, agility, transformation. the future. Finally, after 15 minutes of insult wrapped in jargon, he got to the point. He was restructuring the team. He would be taking a more hands-on role in critical infrastructure. My production admin access would be transferred to him effective immediately. I would move into a support role focused on documentation and legacy system maintenance. I asked him to clarify. I wanted every word clean in my memory. He did. Said he would personally oversee production database administration. Said I would focus on what fit my strengths. Documentation. Legacy systems. That was what 19 years became in his mouth. A filing cabinet and a museum wing. I asked whether Barbara had approved this restructuring. He said Barbara trusted his judgment on technical matters. That was why she had hired him. That was why he had authority. I asked whether he wanted a proper briefing on the production systems before transition. Architecture walkthrough, fail-safes, redundancies, the ugly little details that made everything work. He waved one hand like brushing dust out of the air. Said he had read the documentation, said he understood the architecture from diagrams and specs, said cloud systems were cloud systems. Same principles everywhere. That was the moment I knew exactly what kind of mistake he was. I stood, told him I'd forward the access transition request to IT security and document the change. Told him he could let me know if he had any questions about the documentation. He looked almost surprised that I wasn't fighting. Maybe he expected tears, maybe outrage. Maybe a scene dramatic enough to confirm whatever stereotype he had built about older employees who couldn't keep up. What he got instead was my calm, and my calm has frightened people before. Because calm means I'm finished explaining. I walked back to my desk, opened the necessary systems, and began the transfer paperwork. Every change documented, every access revision timestamped, every message copied. Barbara CC'd on all of it. Paper trails matter, especially when arrogance is moving fast. By 4 o'clock, Drew stopped by my desk looking uneasy. He'd had his own meeting with Brandon. 30 minutes of corporate repositioning language and vague threats dressed up as performance strategy. You okay? He asked quietly. I'm fine, I said. He hesitated. He's changing reporting lines, wants new certification paths, says everybody has 6 months to meet cloud benchmarks. Drew already had more real certifications than most managers I'd met. That wasn't the point. The point was control. I swiveled slightly toward him. Document everything, I said. He frowned. Everything? Every system change, every approval, every time he touches production, keep timestamps, screenshots, save the emails. He studied my face for a second, like he knew there was more under the sentence than I was giving him. Why? He asked. I turned back to my monitor. Because documentation is important. That wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. And somewhere beneath the fluorescent office lights, under the hum of systems I knew better than some people know their own families, I felt it settle in my chest. Not fear, not even anger anymore, just certainty. Brandon Kessler had walked into a room he didn't understand and mistaken confidence for control. He had taken the wheel from someone who knew every bend in the road, and sooner or later, the road was going to teach him the difference. The first 3 weeks after Brandon Kessler took over felt less like a leadership transition and more like watching someone walk into a machine room with a blowtorch and a grin. He moved fast. Too fast. That kind of speed only impresses people who don't understand the cost of momentum when the thing you're moving is fragile, interconnected, and carrying the weight of hundreds of thousands of client records. By the second morning, Brandon had already started talking about redefining departmental culture. By the fourth, he was speaking as if Whitmore's entire infrastructure had personally offended him. By the end of the first week, he brought in 2 consultants from his old firm in Chicago. They arrived like a matched set. Same polished shoes, same expensive suits, same habit of speaking in confident half-sentences that sounded intelligent until you listened closely and realized they were saying almost nothing. One was named Ethan Rowe, the other was Lucas Vale. Both men carried tablets instead of notebooks. Both walked through the data center like they were touring a condemned building. And both wore the kind of expression people use when they need the room to know they consider themselves smarter than everyone already in it. Brandon introduced them during a morning meeting, like he was presenting reinforcements in a war he'd invented. He said they were there to conduct a full architecture review. 3 days of deep analysis. 3 days of identifying inefficiencies. 3 days of mapping Whitmore's infrastructure to a more scalable, modernized future. He used the phrase future-ready 3 times before 10 a.m. I sat at the edge of the conference table with Janet on one side of me and Drew a few seats down, typing notes into a plain black notebook app while Brandon projected diagrams onto the wall like he was unveiling a miracle. What he was really unveiling was contempt. Every system we ran was suddenly a problem. Our database structure? Inefficient. Our backup procedures? Wasteful. Our failover protections? Redundant. Our monitoring alerts? Over-engineered. Our security protocols? Too layered. Our network segmentation? Antiquated. It was almost impressive. 19 years of carefully built, field-tested, regulator-surviving infrastructure reduced to a list of flaws by 3 men who had been inside the building for less than 10 days. At one point, Ethan zoomed in on one of our disaster recovery diagrams and said, "This kind of layered fallback architecture is common in legacy-minded teams that haven't fully embraced cloud-native resiliency." Cloud-native resiliency. He said it like a prayer. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screen. That legacy-minded architecture was the reason Whitmore had survived the ransomware attack in 2019. It was the reason clients never knew how close we came to catastrophe. It was the reason Barbara still had a company to run. But none of that mattered in the room, because what Brandon and his consultants were selling wasn't technical judgment. It was theater. Expensive theater. And the executives loved theater because theater came with slides and confidence and pretty phrases like transformation roadmap. During the lunch break on day 1, Janet cornered me near the vending machines. She kept her voice low. "This is insane." I unwrapped a protein bar I hadn't wanted and probably wouldn't finish. She looked irritated by my calm. "No, Naomi, I'm serious. They don't understand half of what they're criticizing." Lucas called the compliance archive duplicative bloat. It's there because legal made us build it. "I know." And Brandon nodded like that was some kind of breakthrough. "I know." She folded her arms. "You're being too quiet." I looked at her then. Janet knew me well enough to hear what I wasn't saying. Quiet didn't mean passive. Quiet meant I was measuring the blast radius. "Do you want me to stand up in the middle of a meeting and tell them they're arrogant idiots?" I asked. Her mouth twitched. "It would improve morale." For about 6 minutes. Then she sighed, because she knew I was right. Brandon had Barbara's trust, the director title, and just enough executive charm to make resistance look like bitterness. If I pushed too early, I wouldn't stop him. I'd only make myself easier to dismiss. So instead I watched. And I recorded everything. Not secretly, not dramatically. Just professionally. Every recommendation. Every criticism. Every system they targeted. Every approval Brandon gave with that bright, self-congratulatory voice. At the end of day 2, Drew stopped by my cubicle after most people had gone home. He stood there with a paper cup of stale coffee, shoulders tight. "He wants us all enrolled in new certification tracks," he said. I kept typing for a moment before answering. I assumed he would. He said current credentials don't reflect the direction of the department. Drew had 12 years in IT. Multiple cloud certifications. Security certifications. Platform certifications. Brandon probably couldn't pass without a cheat sheet and a rehearsal. But Drew was practical, not flashy. He didn't perform intelligence. He used it. "Did he put that in writing?" I asked. "Some of it. The rest was in the meeting." "Then summarize the verbal part in an email to yourself. Timestamp it. Save it." He tilted his head. "You really think this is going somewhere bad?" I finally looked up. Yes. That landed heavier than I intended. His face changed. Not panic, recognition. Because Drew had been there long enough to know I didn't dramatize. If I said something was going wrong, it usually already was. On the 3rd day of the architecture review, Brandon's team presented their conclusions to Barbara and the executive group. The room was fuller than usual. Barbara at the head of the table, the CFO to her right, already staring at cost projections, a couple of department heads pretending they understood the technical slides, Brandon near the screen, posture perfect, expression glowing with the self-belief of a man who had never yet paid for being wrong. His proposal was sweeping. Full migration to a new cloud platform, replacement of the current production database framework, elimination of on-premises backup infrastructure, implementation of a cloud-native disaster recovery solution, security consolidation into a unified framework, timeline, 6 months, budget, $1.2 million. He made it sound inevitable, necessary, bold. Barbara asked smart business questions. What would the downtime look like? How would the migration affect operational continuity? What were the cost savings long term? The consultants answered with polished confidence. Manageable disruption, improved agility, streamlined efficiency, scalable resilience. Every answer sounded expensive and vague. When Barbara opened the floor to questions from the technical team, I raised my hand. Brandon noticed it immediately. I saw something flicker behind his expression. Not fear, annoyance. He smiled anyway. Go ahead, Naomi. I kept my tone neutral. What are the rollback procedures if the migration hits instability in production? Before either consultant could answer, Brandon stepped in. Modern platforms are built around redundancy, he said. Rollback-heavy thinking tends to come from older infrastructure models where changes were inherently brittle. A few people at the table nodded because it sounded sophisticated. I folded my hands. So there is no documented rollback plan? Lucas jumped in then, trying to soften the gap. We'd approach issues through stage correction and forward remediation. Forward remediation, a phrase designed to hide the fact that their answer was no. I wrote it down. Then I asked about compliance, the retention mandates, the regulatory reconstruction requirements, the audit expectations around backup verification and recovery traceability. Ethan answered this time, said compliance alignment would be addressed in Phase 3, after the core architecture transition was completed. I let a beat of silence sit in the room. After? I asked. He gave me the smile consultants use when they think precision is a personality flaw. Yes, once the infrastructure base is modernized, meaning after they had already dismantled the structures currently keeping us compliant. The CFO didn't react. Barbara looked thoughtful, but not alarmed enough. Brandon stepped back in smoothly, talking about strategic sequencing and modernization priorities and minimizing friction. He was good at that, good at talking over the exact point where alarm should have begun. So I asked one more question. The real one. What is the specifics migration plan for the production transaction database? The room went quieter. That database was the heart of Whitmore. Every financial transaction, every client adjustment, every reporting trail, every critical process that could not be down for more than 15 minutes without triggering a chain of regulatory consequences none of the executives wanted to imagine. Brandon smiled at me with the confidence of a man standing on a trapdoor he couldn't see. That's my top priority, he said. I'll personally oversee it. Personally, as if that was comforting. As if his hands on it were an extra safeguard rather than the beginning of the problem. I looked at Barbara. She looked back at me. And for just 1 second, I thought maybe she could hear the warning in the room. Maybe she could feel it sitting there beneath the polished language. But Brandon kept talking, and the moment passed. 2 days later, Barbara approved the project. Full budget, full timeline, full authority for Brandon to implement whatever changes he considered necessary. By that afternoon, Brandon had sent a company-wide email celebrating Whitmore's bold leap into next-generation infrastructure modernization. It was full of phrases like transformational change, innovation-driven leadership, and positioning for the future. I read it once, archived it, and saved a copy. Paper trails matter. That evening, Drew came to my desk after most of the floor had emptied out. He didn't bother sitting. Janet's updating her resume, he said. I kept my eyes on the log window open on my screen. That sounds smart. He waited for more. When I didn't give it, he exhaled sharply. Naomi. I looked up. The whole team knows this is a disaster. I know. Then why aren't you fighting it? Because I had already seen this kind of man before. Because Brandon wasn't cautious enough to fail slowly. Because men like him always believed consequences were things that happened to other people. Because sometimes the fastest way to expose incompetence wasn't to block it. It was to make sure it was fully documented when it happened in plain sight. But what I said was simpler. Because right now, he still has enough rope to call it strategy. Drew stared at me. Then quietly. And later? I closed the log window and faced him fully. Later, I said, the rope becomes evidence. He went still at that. I could see the exact moment he understood I wasn't waiting to be rescued by management. I was waiting for facts to become impossible to ignore. He gave one slow nod. I'll keep logging everything. Good. Everything? Everything. He left after that, and I sat alone in the soft, electric hum of the office. A cleaning cart rattled somewhere down the hallway. The lights above the cubicles buzzed faintly. My monitor reflected the older face Brandon had decided meant obsolescence. Fine lines at the corners of my eyes. Silver threaded through dark hair. The kind of face that had stayed awake through outages, audits, recoveries, and nights nobody else even knew were emergencies. He had looked at that face and seen age. He had not seen memory. He had not seen pattern recognition. He had not seen the thousands of invisible decisions it takes to keep a system upright year after year without drama. That was his mistake. March arrived, and with it, the migration. Brandon and his consultants started making weekend changes to environments I had spent years tuning carefully. They replaced configurations that worked with configurations that photographed well in documentation. They removed redundancies they labeled inefficient. They disabled certain monitoring alerts because they were, according to Lucas, creating noise that undermined signal clarity. Signal clarity. That was one way to describe not wanting warning sirens while you were causing the problem they were designed to detect. Every time a test failed, Brandon blamed legacy interference. Every time performance dipped, he blamed technical debt. Every time authentication broke, he blamed outdated dependencies. Never his changes. Never their assumptions. Never the fact that they were operating in a regulated financial environment as if they were reskinning a startup sandbox. 2 weeks in, the test environment started coughing. Database connections timing out, authentication errors spreading in clusters, performance degradation nobody could explain cleanly. Temporary fixes layered on top of unstable changes. Brandon began scheduling alignment sessions, more meetings, more urgent faces, more talk. He brought in additional consultant hours, more invoices, more slide decks, more confidence. The problem stayed. I did exactly what he had told me to do. Documentation, legacy maintenance, nothing more. When asked direct questions, I answered them. When asked for historical context, I provided it. But I never volunteered strategy. I never gave away what he had stripped from me and then devalued. If my expertise wasn't wanted in February, it wasn't free in March. Janet noticed. One evening, after a long meeting about migration blockers, she caught up with me near the elevator. "Do you ever feel bad?" she asked quietly. I pressed the call button. About what? About seeing it coming. The elevator hadn't arrived yet. The hallway was empty. For a second, her voice softened. "You know they're going to break something serious." I looked at the closed elevator doors. "Yes, and you're still not going to stop them." That one sat between us longer. When I answered, I kept my voice even. I offered a briefing. He declined. I offered transition support. He dismissed it. He took authority. He took access. He made sure every critical decision went through him. I turned to face her. "Janet, there's a difference between refusing to be exploited and refusing to care. Don't confuse the two." Her eyes searched mine. Then the elevator dinged. Before the doors fully opened, she said, "I hope when it happens, Barbara is finally looking in the right direction." I stepped inside. So do I. By late April, the problems were no longer staying inside test. Production began to strain. Not full collapse, not yet. Just warning signs. Slow response times during peak usage. Brief connection drops. Small irregularities that looked harmless to people who didn't understand what small irregularities usually grew into. Brandon called them normal transition friction. Said the architecture was stabilizing. Said everyone needed to stop being reactive and trust the process. Trust the process. That phrase almost made me laugh. Because infrastructure doesn't care about trust. It cares about design, discipline, verification, and whether the person at the wheel knows the difference between a controlled risk and a vanity move. One Friday afternoon, near the end of April, I stood alone in the data center across town, checking a legacy system Brandon hadn't gotten around to dismantling yet. The room was cool, steady, filled with the familiar sound of fans and machinery and ordered life. This was the kind of place where truth lived. Not in conference rooms, not in management language, not in bullet points. In blinking lights, in clean logs, in systems that either worked or didn't. I rested one hand lightly against a rack cabinet and let myself breathe for a moment. Somewhere behind me, a footstep echoed. It was Drew. He looked tired, the kind of tired that starts in the eyes. "He's pushing up the production timeline," he said. I turned fully. "How far?" "He wants key migration phases moved into early May." "Did the consultants sign off?" He shook his head. "They have concerns." Of course they did. Even opportunists develop instincts when enough money is on the line. "Did Barbara approve it?" "Not directly." I let that settle. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Did Brandon approve it?" Drew swallowed. "Yes." I nodded once. And in that cold, humming room, with metal cabinets standing around us like witnesses, I felt the shape of the future become suddenly clear. Not because I wanted disaster, because I knew its sound before it arrived. It always came the same way. First arrogance, then shortcuts, then delay disguised as confidence, then one decision too fast, too proud, too under-verified. And after that, red May 3rd, Friday, the kind of day that should have ended quietly. Instead, it started with urgency that didn't belong. I was at my desk just after lunch, reviewing documentation Brandon had asked me to clean up, his words, when Drew appeared beside me. Not walking, not even really standing still, hovering, like his body hadn't decided whether to run or stay. "Naomi." I didn't look up immediately. That was intentional. Panic spreads faster when you mirror it. "What happened?" I asked calmly. He swallowed, hard. "He's doing it." That got my attention. I turned my chair toward him. "Doing what?" The production migration, today, right now. For a second, I just looked at him. No reaction. No visible shift. But inside, everything locked into place. So, I said quietly, he moved the timeline. Drew nodded quickly. He said we're behind schedule. Said the test issues are manageable. Said we'll stabilize in production faster. Did Barbara approve this? No. Consultants? They pushed back. Recommended waiting at least another week. And Drew's voice dropped. He overruled them. Of course he did. Because at this point, this wasn't about infrastructure anymore. It was about proving he was right. And men like Brandon Kessler didn't slow down when they were wrong. They accelerated. I turned back to my screen. Make sure your logs are up to date. Drew blinked. That's it? That's it? He stared at me for a long second. Waiting. Hoping. Maybe even expecting me to stand up, march across the building and stop it. But that moment had already passed. It passed back in February, when he took the access, when he dismissed the knowledge, when he replaced experience with confidence. I'll log everything, Drew said finally. Good. He left. And I kept working. The migration started at 2 p.m. Brandon and his consultants were physically in the data center across town. The rest of us were dialed into a video call. Observers. That was what we had been reduced to. Observers of our own systems. I sat back in my chair, headset on, watching the shared screen like I was watching a slow-motion collision I had already seen in my head 100 times. At first, it looked fine. Progress bars moved. Logs scrolled. Status updates ticked forward. Brandon's voice came through the call, steady and confident. Everything's proceeding exactly as expected. Of course it was. Disasters don't announce themselves at the beginning. They build quietly. At 3:22 p.m., Brandon posted in the team chat. Ahead of schedule. A few minutes later, migration smoother than anticipated. Then, this is what happens when you trust modern architecture. I didn't respond. I just watched. At 3:41 p.m., another message came through. Final phase. Cleaning up temporary data. That was the moment. The exact moment. The kind you only recognize instantly if you've lived through enough failures to know how they announce themselves. I leaned forward slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough to see more clearly. 3:47 p.m. Everything went red. It didn't happen slowly. It never does. 1 second, the monitoring dashboards were green. The next, warnings flickered. Yellow. Then, a cascade. Red. Connection failures. Transaction errors. Database timeouts. Alerts stacking so fast the system couldn't display them cleanly. It was like watching a dam crack and then disappear. Drew was at my desk before the first full minute passed. He looked like he'd seen something die. It's down. I didn't ask what. I already knew. What happened? I said. His voice shook. He ran a cleanup script. Pause. He thought he was in staging. Another pause. He wasn't. I closed my eyes for half a second. Just enough to feel it. Not shock. Not surprise. Recognition. What did it hit? I asked. Drew's face drained further. The transaction table. I opened my eyes. How much? He didn't answer immediately, because he didn't want to say it. Drew. 18 months. The room felt quieter. Not actually quieter, but like the sound had been pulled out of it. Client scope? I asked. 300,000. I leaned back in my chair. 18 months of financial transaction history. Gone. Not corrupted. Not inaccessible. Deleted. What about backups? I asked. And that was when his expression broke completely. He disabled them. Which ones? The legacy system, 3 weeks ago, said it was consuming resources. And the new cloud backups? Drew shook his head slowly. Not configured yet. That was phase 3. Phase 3. I let out a slow breath. So what do we have? A backup from 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. In a financial services company. 3 weeks of missing transaction data wasn't an inconvenience. It was a regulatory nightmare. A legal exposure. A trust collapse. What is he doing right now? I asked. In his office. Consultants? Gone. Of course they were. Consultants sell strategy. They don't stay for consequences. I turned back to my screen. Resumed typing. Drew stared at me. You're just going to keep working? Yes. He didn't move. Didn't understand. Couldn't. Not yet. Go update your logs, I said quietly. He hesitated, then nodded, and left. It took about 20 minutes. That's how long it took for panic to break through Brandon's control. 20 minutes for denial to burn off. 20 minutes for reality to catch up. Then he appeared at my desk. He didn't knock. Didn't hesitate. Just stopped in front of me like he'd run the whole way there. His suit, perfect that morning, was wrinkled now. Tie loosened, hair slightly out of place. Face flushed, then pale. His voice cracked on the first word. Naomi. I looked up slowly. Took my time. Yes? I need your help. There it was. Simple. Stripped of everything. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of help? The production database. There's been an issue. An issue. I almost admired that. Even now, he couldn't say it. Define issue, I said. His jaw tightened. It's down. I'm aware. I need someone with deep system knowledge to help recover it. There was a tremor in his voice now. Not just stress. Fear. This is an emergency, he added quickly. The entire company is at risk. I nodded once. Sounds serious. He stared at me, waiting for me to move, to stand, to fix it, to become the solution he had dismissed 3 months ago. I don't have production access, I said calmly. You revoked it in February. I can restore it, he said immediately. I already contacted IT security. They're processing it now. Of course he had. Now access mattered. Now knowledge mattered. Now experience mattered. I tilted my head slightly. Brandon, I said softly, do you remember our first meeting? He blinked, confused. Naomi, we don't have time. You said something, I continued, voice steady, about people my age. He went still. I could see the memory hitting him. You said cloud systems required a different kind of thinking, I went on, that younger professionals adapted better, that cognitive flexibility declines with age. His face changed, from panic to something worse. Recognition. I didn't, he started. You said it wasn't a criticism, I said. Just biological reality. Naomi, please. So, I finished quietly, I don't understand the cloud. Silence. Heavy. Complete. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I didn't mean it like that, he said quickly. I was establishing leadership style? Yes, no, I was wrong. There it was. Finally. I was wrong, he repeated, more desperate now. We can talk about that later. Right now, I need your help. Later. Always later. Later, when the damage was already done. I looked at him for a long moment, really looked, at the fear in his eyes, at the collapse of certainty, at the man who had walked into a system he didn't understand and broken it faster than anyone I had seen in years. Call your consultants, I said. They designed the architecture. They're not answering, he said, voice rising. I've tried. Then keep trying. Naomi. They said rollback procedures were legacy thinking, I continued evenly. They said cloud systems handle redundancy. His hands clenched. This isn't the time. This is exactly the time. He stared at me, waiting, still believing, somewhere deep inside, that I would stand up, that I would save him, that I would save all of them. Because that's what people like me did. That's what I had always done. I gestured toward the hallway. You should go, I said. He didn't move. For a second, just one. I almost felt it. The pull. The instinct. 19 years of stepping in before things broke too far. But that instinct belonged to a system where my expertise was trusted, where my judgment had weight, where my access hadn't been stripped away to prove a point. That system no longer existed. Not by my choice. By his. Is there anything else? I asked. His face hardened. Just for a second. A flicker of something ugly. Then it collapsed again under the weight of what was happening. He turned. Walked away. Didn't look back. By 5 p.m., the situation was no longer containable. Barbara had been in meetings all afternoon. She had no idea. Not yet. Her assistant came running into IT, voice tight, eyes wide. What's going on? Systems are down. Clients are calling. I looked up. Calm. Controlled. The director of IT infrastructure is handling it, I said. Brandon Kessler. His office is down the hall. She ran. 15 minutes later, Barbara appeared. And the moment she stepped into the room, I knew. She knew. Not the details. Not yet. But she knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. She walked straight to my desk. Naomi. Just my name. Nothing else. What happened? I met her eyes. And for the first time that day, I didn't soften anything. What happened? Barbara's voice didn't shake. That was the first thing I noticed. Not because she wasn't afraid. Because she was holding it in place. The way leaders do when they understand, instinctively, that panic spreads faster than truth. I met her eyes. And I gave her exactly what she needed. Facts. Brandon assumed full control of production systems in February, I said evenly. My admin access was revoked as part of that transition. 3 weeks ago, he approved disabling the legacy backup infrastructure during migration prep. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. The replacement cloud backup solution, she asked? Not fully configured. That was scheduled for phase 3. A pause. Short. Controlled. Today? She asked. He accelerated the production database migration without completing testing or compliance review. During final cleanup, he executed a script against production instead of staging. I held her gaze. The transaction table was deleted. Another pause. This one heavier. How much data? 18 months. How many clients? Approximately 300,000. That was the moment. The exact moment the weight of it landed. Not in her posture. Not in her voice. but in the silence between her breaths, she looked past me briefly at the monitors, the alerts still cascading, the quiet panic moving through the room. Then she looked back. Can you recover it? Direct. No emotion in the question. Just necessity. I don't currently have production access, I said, because Brandon revoked it in February. That was the first crack. A flicker of anger beneath her control. Then I'll restore it, she said immediately. Right now. She turned slightly, already reaching for her phone. I'll call IT security myself. I nodded once. I'll need full access to all systems, logs, configurations, external integrations. You'll have it. And full authority over the recovery process. She didn't hesitate. You have it. No interference, I added, from Brandon or his consultants. That was the only point where she paused. Not long. Just enough to confirm she understood exactly what that meant. Then, agreed. She exhaled slowly. What about Brandon? That wasn't a technical question. That was a leadership one. I chose my words carefully. That's your decision, I said, but I recommend legal and HR be present when you speak to him. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not in disagreement. In understanding. This is going to be complicated, I finished. She nodded once, then turned and walked away. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Just direction. The access came back within minutes. Faster than I'd ever seen IT security move. Barbara had made the call personally. I logged in. Production systems opened in front of me like a body on a table. Broken. Incomplete. But not dead. Not yet. Drew, I said without looking away from the screen. I'm here. Pull the last full backup 3 weeks ago. Already on it. Janet? Right here. She moved up beside me, already pulling logs onto a secondary monitor. What's the damage pattern? She asked. Full transaction table wipe. We're rebuilding from external sources. She nodded once. No panic. No wasted reaction. Just movement. That's why I'd recommended her. Because when things broke, she didn't freeze. She worked. The next 14 hours blurred. Not because I forgot them. Because they were too dense to experience in real time. Every second mattered. Every decision carried weight. We started with the backup from 3 weeks ago. A skeleton. Stable but incomplete. Then we began reconstruction. Bank records. Clearing houses. Payment processors. External audit trails. Client management systems. Every connection Whitmore had became a lifeline. We pulled transaction logs from partners. Cross-referenced account balances. Verified timestamps. Rebuilt records piece by piece. It wasn't clean. It wasn't elegant. It was survival. At some point after midnight, Drew leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. How much do we have? He asked. 40%, Janet said. 42, I corrected. He let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. Feels like less. It always does, I said. Barbara stayed. That surprised me. Most executives don't stay for recovery. They stay for meetings, for reports, for summaries. But Barbara stayed. She moved between desks quietly, checked in without interrupting. Brought coffee no one asked for, but everyone drank. Watched. Learned. At around 3 a.m., she stood beside me. Is this fixable? She asked quietly. Yes. Not confident. Not hopeful. Certain. How long? For full reconstruction, I paused. Weeks. For stability? By Sunday. She nodded. Then asked the question I knew was coming. And if you hadn't been here? I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth mattered. And timing mattered. Then you'd be explaining to regulators why 18 months of financial data no longer exists, I said. She didn't react outwardly. But I saw it land. By Saturday afternoon, we crossed 60%. Core transactions restored. Account balances verified. Critical compliance structures rebuilt. The system wasn't whole, but it was alive again. By Sunday evening, 85%. Enough to operate. Enough to stabilize. Enough to breathe. The remaining 15% would take time, but the company would survive. Monday morning, Barbara called me into her office. She looked like she hadn't slept. Because she hadn't. Neither had I. But exhaustion didn't matter. Not yet. Thank you, she said first. No build-up. No corporate phrasing. Just that. I know you didn't have to help, she added. After everything. I held her gaze. I didn't do it for him. I know. A pause. Then, Brandon has been terminated. Direct. Final. Effective immediately. I nodded once. His consultants have been dismissed. Legal is reviewing their recommendations. Another pause. Then, I want you to take his position. There it was. Director of IT Infrastructure. Power. Title. Authority. Everything Brandon had used to dismantle the system offered back to me. I didn't even need a second. No. She blinked. Actually blinked. Why? Because I had already seen what that role did to people. Because I had just spent 14 hours cleaning up the consequences of someone who valued appearance over function. Because I didn't want to sit in conference rooms explaining systems to people who would never understand them. I don't want to be a director, I said. Her expression shifted. Confusion. Curiosity. I want to do my job, I continued, the one I've been doing for 19 years. Which is? Keeping systems running, building things that work, protecting infrastructure that everything else depends on. She studied me, then asked quietly, "What would make you stay?" There it was, the real question. I didn't hesitate. Senior Principal Systems Architect. Her eyes sharpened slightly. Reporting directly to you. She nodded once. And final approval authority on any infrastructure changes affecting production systems. That last part hung in the air, because it mattered, because it changed everything, because it ensured this would never happen again. She didn't hesitate. Done. Just like that. No negotiation. No delay. Because now, she understood the cost of getting it wrong. Who should take the director role, she asked next. I didn't even need to think. Janet Holloway. She raised an eyebrow. Why? Because she understands the systems. Because she's built half of them. Because the team trusts her. Because she won't confuse confidence with competence. Barbara nodded slowly. I'll set up interviews. You don't need interviews, I said. That got her attention. You need results. Another pause. Then, a small, tired smile. I'll still run the interviews, she said. Of course you will. The weeks after were quieter. Not easy, but controlled. We rebuilt everything Brandon had broken. Restored configurations. Re-implemented backup systems. Verified every layer. Tested every failure scenario. The same systems they had called outdated became the foundation again. Janet got the director role. First thing she did, called a full team meeting. No buzzwords. No theater. Just truth. This happened, she said. Here's why. Here's how we make sure it never happens again. Drew was promoted to senior admin. His logs, every timestamp, every screenshot, became the backbone of the internal investigation. The consultant sent a legal threat. Our legal team responded with documentation. Detailed. Precise. Unarguable. We never heard from them again. By late June, we had recovered everything. Every transaction. Every record. Every missing piece. Regulators completed their audit. No violations. Because we had proof. Because we had logs. Because we had done the work. Barbara sent a company-wide email praising the IT team. Didn't mention Brandon. Didn't need to. Everyone knew. 3 weeks later, I received a notification. LinkedIn. Brandon Kessler updated his profile. New role. Cloud Transformation Consultant. Austin, Texas. His summary talked about driving innovation, leading modernization, delivering scalable cloud solutions. No mention of Whitmore. No mention of the database. No mention of the $2.8 million recovery cost. Drew showed it to me during lunch. What do you think? He asked. I looked at the screen, then at him. Screenshot it. He frowned. Why? Because it might be useful. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I already knew. This wasn't over yet. Drew didn't ask again. He just took the screenshot, saved it, timestamped it, added it to the same folder where every decision Brandon had made now lived in quiet, undeniable detail. That folder had weight. Not physical, but real. Because facts, properly recorded, don't fade. They wait. 2 weeks later, they were needed. Barbara got a call late Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing a vendor proposal when her assistant appeared. Naomi, Barbara needs you. Her tone told me everything I needed to know. Not urgent. Not panicked. But deliberate. I walked into Barbara's office. She was on the phone. Held up one finger for me to wait. I closed the door behind me. Yes, I understand, she was saying. You're considering him for a consulting role? Pause. She listened. Then, let me transfer you to someone who can give you a more detailed answer. She looked at me, not asking, deciding, and handed me the phone. Naomi Mercer, I said. The voice on the other end was calm, measured. This is Howard Reeves, CTO at a financial services firm in Dallas. I appreciate you taking the time. Of course. I'm calling regarding Brandon Kessler. He listed Whitmore Financial as a recent engagement. His profile indicates he led a successful cloud transformation initiative. I almost smiled. Almost. What would you like to know? I asked. There was a pause. The kind that comes when someone already suspects the answer won't match the resume. I'd like to understand the scope of his work there, Howard said. Specifically, outcomes. Outcomes. Not intentions. Not strategy. Outcomes. I leaned back slightly in my chair. And I told him, everything. Not with anger. Not with embellishment. Just the truth. The revoked access. The disabled backup systems. The accelerated migration. The ignored warnings. The deletion of the production transaction table. The 18 months of lost data. The $2.8 million recovery effort. The full reconstruction. I didn't raise my voice, didn't dramatize, didn't speculate. Just facts. Clear, linear, verifiable. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. Then, a quiet exhale. I thought something didn't add up, Howard said. Usually doesn't, I replied. He described the migration as complex, but ultimately successful. I let that sit for a second, then said, it was successful in the same way a plane crash is a successful landing. There was a pause. Then, a short, surprised laugh. Understood, Howard said. I appreciate your candor. Anytime. We ended the call. I handed the phone back to Barbara. She studied me for a moment. You didn't hold back. I didn't add anything either. She nodded. That's why I trust you. 2 days later, I got a message. LinkedIn. From Brandon Kessler. First contact since the day he walked away from my desk. I opened it. Read it once. Then again. Short. Sharp. Angry. He accused me of sabotaging his career. Called me bitter. Said I was jealous. Said I was spreading false information. Threatened legal action for defamation. I didn't respond. Didn't need to. I forwarded the message to our legal team. Attached, Drew's logs. Every change. Every approval. Every decision. Time-stamped. Screenshotted. Permanent. Legal sent it back to Brandon's lawyer. That was the last I ever heard from him. But consequences don't always end cleanly. Sometimes, they keep unfolding. 3 months later, an email arrived. Official. From the Ohio Department of Commerce, Division of Financial Institutions. They were conducting a formal review. Standard procedure after a major data incident. The investigator's name was Linda Patterson. She scheduled a 4-hour interview. In person. I agreed. She arrived on a Tuesday morning. Professional. Precise. The kind of person who didn't waste time on unnecessary words. We sat in a small conference room. She opened a notebook. Walk me through it, she said. So I did. From the beginning. The architecture. The backups. The migration. The moment everything went red. She took notes. Asked questions. Followed threads. Requested documentation. I gave her everything. No defensiveness. No hesitation. Because truth doesn't require performance. At the end, she closed her notebook. Then looked at me. One question. I nodded. Could this have been prevented? Simple. Direct. Important. Yes, I said. No pause. No hesitation. How? If I had retained production access, I replied, I would have stopped the migration the moment he connected to the wrong environment. She watched me closely. You're certain? Yes. Then why didn't you have access? There it was. The question that mattered more than all the others. Because it wasn't technical. It was human. I held her gaze. Because Brandon revoked it in February, I said. He believed I was too old to understand the cloud. She wrote that down. Exactly. Didn't comment. Didn't react. Just recorded it. Then she stood. Thank you, Ms. Mercer. And left. 2 months later, the report was released. Public. Detailed. Final. Whitmore Financial. No fines. No compliance violations. Because the recovery had been thorough. Because the documentation had been complete. Because we had done the work. But the report didn't stop there. It named responsibility. Directly. Brandon Kessler. His decisions. His approvals. His actions. Documented. Permanent. Public record. That kind of record follows you. Not loudly. Not immediately. But consistently. Quietly. Relentlessly. I know. Because 2 separate companies called Barbara to verify it. Both times, she transferred them to me. Both times, I told the truth. After the second call, they stopped coming. Last I heard, Brandon was working at a SaaS startup in Portland. Entry level. No team. No production authority. No decisions that could break anything important. Probably still telling people he was a victim. Of politics. Of jealousy. Of legacy thinking. People like him always have a version of the story where they're misunderstood. It just doesn't matter anymore. At Whitmore, things settled. Janet ran the department. Calm. Focused. No theater. No buzzwords. Just work. Real work. She implemented improvements. Properly. With testing. With rollback plans. With verification. The changes Brandon promised. Finally delivered. Correctly. Drew stepped into his new role. Confident now. Sharpened. He turned down an offer from a recruiter in Seattle. Better pay. Bigger title. He stayed. Said he still had things to learn. He was right. Barbara increased the IT budget by 15%. Said she had learned something. Infrastructure wasn't where you cut corners. It was where you survived. The backup systems I had built. Restored. Upgraded. Tested quarterly. Monitored continuously. The way they should have been all along. I got my title. Senior Principal Systems Architect. Direct line to Barbara. Final approval authority over production changes. The first time I used that authority was 3 weeks after Janet took over. A vendor pitched a new cloud backup solution. Polished presentation. Impressive claims. 40% cost reduction. I reviewed their documentation. Found 3 critical gaps in recovery procedures. Sent my analysis to Janet. Recommendation. Decline. She declined. System stayed stable. That's what success looks like. Not headlines. Not applause. Not transformation speeches. Just nothing breaking. 6 months after the incident, Barbara called me into her office, closed the door, handed me an envelope. Board approved, she said. Inside, a check. $50,000. I looked at it, then at her. This is the least we could do, she said. We would have lost everything. I nodded once. Thank you. I deposited it that afternoon. The following weekend, I bought a new truck. My old one had 180,000 miles and too many small problems pretending not to be big ones. The new one was simple, reliable, did what it was supposed to do. No drama, no surprises. I liked that. Sometimes people ask me what the lesson is. They expect something clean, something easy, something they can turn into a quote. It's never that simple. But if there is one, it's this. Experience doesn't announce itself. It doesn't dress well. It doesn't speak in buzzwords. It doesn't need attention. It just works quietly, consistently, until someone decides that quiet means replaceable. And by the time they realize the difference, it's usually too late. As for Brandon Kessler, I don't think about him much anymore. Because the truth is, I didn't end his career. He did that himself. All I did was make sure the system recorded it.